Hey everyone, my name's Andrew Beccone, and I started this project, the Reanimation Library, about 14 years ago. So this is a project I've been working on for quite a while. And when Mark asked me to do this and told me that this year's theme was journey, I immediately started thinking about the different sorts of journeys that I've had, that the library itself has had, and that the users of the library have had. And I had this kind of feeling, this initial sort of mental picture of like, oh, there are these three parallel journeys that are taking place. And within about 2 seconds, I realized like this is a complete oversimplification of what this model or map would look like. And so I started looking through the library and finding other sorts of diagrams that might make more sense. This is probably closer to what my relationship to the library looks like. Two different things that come together at various points, are connected at certain points, and veer off in certain ways. This is probably a better representation of what library users, how they relate to the library. So if we think of this circle as the library, these kind of radiating lines and dots being the users, this is a more accurate representation. People that have worked with the library have taken it in all sorts of different directions and done all sorts of different things with it. And then I was thinking about my own interactions with people who come and use the library. Sometimes I have no interaction, sometimes I have a little bit, sometimes the interactions get quite involved. So this seemed like a more appropriate diagram of that. The problem is then we've got something that looks like this, and I only have 20 minutes to try and explain these relationships, and there's no way I'm going to explain that. So I'm going to actually go back and sort of parse them out one by one, and I will start with me and my own journey. This is a younger version of me, if you can believe it or not. When I was 19, I started working at the Legislative Reference Library, the state of Minnesota, in the state office building, a very sort of bland government office building in St. Paul, Minnesota. And so my mother was a librarian. She actually was like, you know, you need a job, Andrew. You're no longer in high school. She helped me get this job there. I was an aide there for many years. And one of the great things, there were a number of great things about working there, but one of them was that it was full of a couple really great photocopy machines. And so when I was bored at work, I would use those photocopy machines to make things like this. And I had a lot of fun using the photocopier as a tool for generating images. The problem being that the Legislative Reference Library, not a very visually interesting collection. If you're into statutes, it is a goldmine. So most of the visual material I was pulling from in that library would be like newspapers from small towns, things like that. So one day, I came across this book in a thrift store, and as a real actual like gift, when I years later cataloged this book, I found the receipt in it. This is the book that sort of led me on this journey. I bought it on September 8th, 2001. I spent $1.37 on this book. The Behavior of Man, An Introduction to Psychology. Psychology books, of course, are always sort of interesting because they are trying to visualize and map these interior states. So this book was full of images like this, like this, the Chimpomat is one of my favorite images. This book is really, truly a gem. It's an amazing book, and I was sort of floored by it, and as soon as I got this book, I thought, okay, this book is incredible. It has no market value whatsoever. I've just spent less than $1.50 for it. I should probably be looking for more books like this. And so I soon realized that there were lots of these things out there. This is kind of an incredible book, which relates to an earlier speech. But this is actually a textbook that purports to tell you how to engineer an atmosphere on a planet that doesn't have one, which I gather we haven't quite figured out how to do that yet. It's also published by the Society of Automotive Engineers. Pretty weird. Then there's all these kinds of books, about exploration, of the sea, of outer space, of the body. Lots of medicine, medical books, books that are trying to explain things. And all of the books, all the sort of commonality in these books is that what I'm interested in is the visual information that they contain. So these are precisely the kinds of books that most libraries would get rid of. And I have a master's in library science. My mother was a librarian. I have a lot of sympathy for libraries. I understand they need to weed their collections. And I'm glad they have to weed their collections, because then I can cull from the things they've gotten rid of and build my own collection. It's also interesting to see these sort of resonances that, like a book like this obviously is now, in light of like the Snowden revelations, this becomes kind of a more interesting and more relevant book. It was published in the 70s. I often say that the library is a nonfiction collection, but there are books like this that I would say maybe would refute that notion a little bit. There's a fair amount of sort of parascience and New Age material. Pastimes that most of us don't engage in anymore. Again, some kind of parascience. This doesn't work. I have terrible eyesight, and if you read this book and do what it says, it doesn't work. These kind of early books about, technological, like how are we beginning to integrate technology into our lives. And then, sort of standard, boring textbook type material. But what I'm interested in, again, in all of this material are the images that they contain. So as a visual artist, this was this gold mine of stuff. And I thought to myself, as the collection got bigger and bigger, I can't keep this to myself. Lots of visual artists have sort of collections of material that they'll go to and look at for inspiration. And so, this is amazing, by the way. It's both amazing and reassuring. This is from a book called Xanadu, The Computerized House of Tomorrow and How It Can Be Yours Today. And it's actually sort of interesting because it's basically like an Internet of Things house. But we are not talking about robots that deliver roses and croissants. That, if we ever get fully the Internet of Things, that's my request. So I was thinking to myself, I can't keep this to myself. This collection is too good. I want to start. I have to tell you what this is too. This is from a book called Sexual Lovemaking. And it's very unhelpful. So anyone that ever thought they were going to learn anything about sexual lovemaking from this book would be deeply, deeply, deeply disappointed. As someone who's interested in images, I'm also interested in images about how images are made, things like that, and these kinds of diagrammatic images. So it's, sorry, I have to say something about this too. One thing that was interesting is when the library finally became public, and I'll talk about that in a minute, is people kept on coming in and asking about they wanted to see the cookbooks, and I hadn't been collecting cookbooks because I hadn't found them personally that interesting. So I started looking for cookbooks. This is a way that the interaction of users affected the growth of the library. And of course, there's a wonderful era of cookbooks that makes food look completely inedible. And that was a kind of its own gold mine. And so now that collection is growing, thankfully. you also get these really amazing examples of illustration and graphic design that you don't really see somewhere in published books. So, yeah, nice visual metaphor, right? And then there are these images that are basically just the content of the image. This is from a book called Hand Taming Wild Birds. But it's a remarkable image. So anyhow, what happened is I realized, okay, I have these books. I need to share them. I need to turn this into a publicly accessible collection. I need other people to come and use this, in part because I knew that if I did that, people would be using it in a way that I would never use it myself, and it would become a much more dynamic, much more interesting, and a much richer project. So at that point, I decided, this is about a year after I first started collecting books. At that point, I had maybe 50 books, and I started telling everyone, I'm going to turn this into a library. And everyone was like, great, that's a really neat little library you have there, Andrew. And so the library kind of, it was a year of collecting before that kind of idea coalesced in my head. And so the physical journey that the library went on started in the Twin Cities. It was there for its first year and sort of when I conceived of it. It briefly moved to Albuquerque with me for 7 months prior to moving to New York. So in 2003, I moved to New York, and for the first 3 years of that, the library remained in my apartment. And I knew that I needed to get it out of my apartment into a space where other people could access it. I was actually starting to get people coming over to my apartment to use it, and that wasn't really a good arrangement for anyone involved. So in 2006, I brought it into the space called Proteus Gowanus that was in Gowanus, Brooklyn, and as part of a show on artists working with libraries that I helped co-curate. And after a year of that show, after the show ended, I had been getting along with the people that ran Proteus, and they invited me to stay. So for the next 8 years, this was my space at Proteus Gowanus. And as you can see, the library is sort of continuing to grow. At the beginning, when I first moved it in there, it was about 300 volumes. Proteus closed down last summer, so I lost my home at that point. But I will tell you shortly where I ended up. So in 2009, I was invited to Philadelphia to an artist space called Vox Populi, and they said, we want you to come here and do something with your library. And they had this huge room, and I had no idea what I was going to do. So I sort of had to figure it out. And what I decided to do was to invite people to make artwork from the collection, which was already happening, but really to target it, to ask some specific people to do it, create work, exhibit that work, then go to Philadelphia, find all of the books for that particular branch in Philadelphia. And like my main space, a very important component is having a photocopier, having a scanner, having ways for people to actually work with the books. It's not just like, look at these neat books. It's like, look at these books and their continued relevancy. If you want to use them, here's a way for you to do so. So that was in 2009, and then they just kept on happening, and people kept on reaching out to me. And so, the library has traveled. Versions of it have traveled, from Philadelphia to London, to Mexico City, Los Angeles, Chicago, Beirut, a town called Osnabrück in Germany that probably most of you have never heard of. I'd never heard of it before that. And so branch libraries are these temporary spaces that are kind of exhibitions. They're also kind of versions of the library. And they're kind of like production spaces. They're spaces where people can come and actually use the books to make things with. This is, that last image was from Mexico City. This is from Joshua Tree. This was the branch in Los Angeles, and the branch in Beirut. And so this is where Mark first encountered it. I was invited by the Museum of Modern Art to bring the entire library into the education building. The education department was putting on this kind of lab that was coinciding with a show that had been organized by the Prince department. And they called me up and they said, we kind of want to have a place for people to have resources to make things, you know, kind of like visual resource where they can scan things and make things. I was like, you want the Reanimation library? And they were like, yes, we want the Reanimation library. So I moved that there for 6 weeks. And it was a really fantastic experience. I mean, obviously working with an institution like MoMA that has a lot of money. They had an amazing photocopy machine. I know, I'm like a nerd, but it did, you know, 4-color separation. It was really just like, oh my God. And they had 4 scanning stations set up. And then they had all these tables, and they had, you know, they had all these kinds of like collage making things. And people would just come in there and use it. And then people were encouraged to just put whatever they wanted to up on the walls. So by the end of the 6 weeks, the walls were covered by all of these things that people had made. This is a branch that I did at the Queens Museum in 2014, which itself was it was part of a group show that was in response to the panorama. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the panorama of the city of New York that's housed at the Queens Museum, but you should be. It's a full-scale replica of the entire city, like every single building represented. It was a Robert Moses project. Anyhow, it's incredible. And so I was invited to take part in that show. And in this case, I selected books from the collection that had certain resonances with the panorama itself. So now I want to talk a little bit about like the user and how the user can experience the library. It is currently housed in the Queens Museum, not in that picture that I just showed you, which is exhibition space. The Queens Museum contains and houses 9 individual artist studios. They have a studio residency program. I was accepted into it and have a studio there for 2 years. I moved in there in October, so I have about another 1.5 years there. People can make appointments and come and use the library there. This is a couple pictures of the studio itself. And so, well, it's not public in quite the same way as it was at Proteus Gowanus. It's still accessible. People are still able to, and I'm getting a lot more appointments. Reanimationlibrary.org is the website. It's every book that's in the collection has been cataloged. I use Library of Congress classification, not Dewey Decimal. People are like, oh, look, you've got Dewey Decimal numbers on it. And I'm like, no, it's Library of Congress. So you can search the catalog, you can browse the catalog. We scan images, cover images, and then in the catalog record, there's going to be images, a handful of images from each book, so you get a sense of the visual information that you would find. You can click on that, get a larger version of that. And also, we're starting to tag that collection, so you can do some kind of searching through that collection as well. That also is a standalone image collection that you can browse. And they tell me you can lose hours of your life doing this, so just be careful. Another way that I've sort of kind of targeted and been a little bit more involved with users of the library is by inviting certain people to write essays. This is a series called Word Processor. And basically, I invite someone to come in and find a book in the collection that they find interesting, and then to write an essay that kind of places that book in a larger context. And part of that was a growing realization that, well, yes, this is a visual collection. I'm also really, really interested and increasingly interested in the language that are contained in these books, and why some of these books were even written in the first place. So that is something that I've been working on for the past 5 years or so. And then just to get back to sort of some of my own interactions with the library, people often ask, so you're a visual artist, and what happened was a year into working on this library, I realized I hadn't made anything that actually looked like visual art, and all my artistic work was going into the library. I understand the library entirely to be a hybrid artwork library. It's both of those things together. But in the past couple of years, I realized I've built this kind of incredible playground, and I wanted to start playing in it. So I was invited, funnily enough, to do an issue of a zine called Nerve Endings that each issue a different artist has been asked to contribute to. So just to finish up, I'm going to show you some spreads from that, just to kind of give you an idea of the work that I've been doing in the collection itself. This is all material that comes directly from the library. So feel free to reach out to me if you ever want to come out and see it, Andrew at reanimationlibrary.org. Check out the website, www.reanimationlibrary.org. Thanks for your time.